Did you see what they just did? Oh my goodness, I can't believe it.
The lights of the ballroom shimmered like tiny stars, catching on the crystal chandeliers and the laughter of people dressed in their finest. The scent of roses and expensive champagne drifted through the air, mingling with the low hum of music. I stood near the edge of it all, watching my brother, the groom, smile wider than I'd seen in years. Everything was perfect, from the ivory linens to the golden cutlery, every detail reflecting the kind of luxury that money could buy. But perfection has a way of cracking when you least expect it. I felt it the moment I turned and saw her. The one woman who wasn't supposed to be there. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her hand brushing against his arm as if she still belonged. The sound of laughter reached my ears. Familiar, easy, intimate. My pulse stumbled, a quiet tremor hidden beneath a polite smile. The guests kept dancing, oblivious. But I knew this night was about to become unforgettable for reasons none of them could imagine. The night was meant to be seamless, a celebration of love wrapped in luxury, the kind of event people would talk about for months. Every guest had been carefully chosen, every detail orchestrated to perfection. I had spent weeks ensuring nothing would disturb the image of grace and elegance my family had built for this wedding. Yet, even the best-laid plans can unravel with a single unexpected face in the crowd. The moment she arrived, the air shifted, not visibly, but like a faint crack running through glass. She stepped out of a black car with a confidence that could silence a room, her gown shimmering under the soft lighting, as if she were born for entrances like this. For a second, no one seemed to recognize her, but my heart did. I felt it before my eyes fully registered her. The tilt of her chin, the familiar poise, the way she scanned the venue as if measuring how much she still mattered in this world. It wasn't just any guest. It was the one person who carried enough history to turn a peaceful night into quiet chaos. She had once been the shadow in my husband's stories, mentioned only when nostalgia or regret slipped into his tone. I had always dismissed it, convincing myself that everyone has a past. But seeing her there, uninvited and glowing with an almost deliberate charm, felt like an invasion of something sacred. I glanced toward him instinctively, trying to gauge his reaction. He was mid-conversation, laughing lightly with a group of business acquaintances, his usual composed self. But when his eyes caught hers, something changed, just a flicker, almost imperceptible but enough. That small spark of recognition told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just a coincidence. She wasn't just passing by. She was here because he wanted her here. The realization hit like a cold wave, numbing and sharp. I smiled mechanically as a few guests passed by, offering compliments about the decor and the music, but my mind was no longer in the celebration. I watched her move closer, each step deliberate, the sound of her heels blending with the rhythm of the orchestra. People began to notice her too. There was something magnetic about her presence, polished, confident, unbothered. She greeted a few familiar faces, pretending as though her attendance was perfectly natural, her laughter smooth and controlled. But beneath the surface, I could sense the tension building, invisible yet tangible, like static before a storm. It wasn't jealousy that burned through me, it was betrayal disguised as surprise. Weddings are sacred in their symbolism. They are about unity, trust, family. To bring her here, of all places, felt like a message written in silence. A quiet reminder that he still had the power to disturb my peace when he wished. I wondered what she thought as she stood there. Did she feel victorious, nostalgic, or simply entertained by the discomfort she was causing? She seemed to know the effect she had, and she wore it like perfume. The ceremony continued, but for me, every vow, every toast, every clink of glass felt like a background hum against the pulse of my thoughts. I could see her reflection in the mirrors that lined the walls, could hear her laughter at the far end of the hall. It was as though the entire evening had bent slightly to make room for her presence. My husband remained calm, his expression unreadable, but I noticed how he avoided my gaze. It was a quiet confession in itself. I thought about confronting him, but not here, not now. There was power in patience, and I refused to let anger write my reactions. Instead, I straightened my posture, adjusted my dress, and smiled for the photographs, the picture of composure. Inside, though, I was cataloging every detail, the way his hand brushed hers during conversation, the subtle look they exchanged when they thought no one was watching, the way she seemed to linger near him instead of blending into the crowd. The irony wasn't lost on me. A night meant to honor love and loyalty had become a stage for deceit, yet no one else seemed to notice. To the guests, everything was perfect. The champagne was flowing, the music was divine, the couple on the dance floor radiant. But I knew the truth beneath the perfection. I could feel it in the way my pulse refused to steady, in the way his smile seemed rehearsed, in the way her presence filled the spaces that were supposed to belong to me. The night went on, glittering on the surface but trembling underneath. Every moment she stayed felt like a challenge, an unspoken dare to see how much I could tolerate before breaking. But I didn't break. I watched, I learned, because sometimes the most powerful move isn't reaction, it's preparation. And as I stood there, quietly observing the unexpected guest my husband had chosen to invite, I realized the night would no longer unfold as planned. It would unfold on my terms. The human body has a strange way of reacting before the mind catches up. A glance too long, a shift in posture, the quickening of breath, all silent indicators of something unspoken. As I watched them from across the room, those tiny gestures between them told stories words could never capture. She stood near the edge of the dance floor, surrounded by laughter, yet her focus was fixed only on him. Her eyes followed him with the ease of someone who had memorized his movements long ago. It wasn't overt or dramatic, it was subtle, practiced, the kind of familiarity that can only come from once being deeply known. He noticed her too, though he tried to pretend otherwise. Every time their paths almost crossed, his hand adjusted his cufflink, or he turned his head slightly away, as if he could hide the reflex to acknowledge her presence. But it was there, an invisible string pulling his attention toward her no matter where he stood. When he greeted guests, his smile was wide and effortless, yet when she laughed, his head tilted instinctively in her direction. It wasn't longing exactly, it was recognition, like seeing a ghost that once felt alive. I stood nearby, observing quietly, pretending to be engrossed in small talk, but my attention was entirely theirs. Their gestures were a language I wasn't meant to understand, yet I understood it too well. The way she brushed her hair behind her ear when he glanced her way, the way he adjusted his tie when she passed, it wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern, a rhythm that once belonged to the two of them, reawakening in a room full of unsuspecting guests. They weren't touching, but every gesture they made touched something deeper, something I didn't want to admit still existed between them. The most painful part wasn't what was happening, it was how quiet it was. No one else seemed to notice. Around us, conversations flowed, the clinking of glasses echoed, and the orchestra played a soft waltz. Yet in that glittering chaos, a private exchange unfolded in silence. She smiled at him across the table, her lips curling in a way that carried memory, not innocence. He returned it with a polite nod, the kind you give when you want to seem casual but your eyes give you away. That one moment was enough to unravel months of supposed peace. Every movement between them had layers. When she leaned forward to speak to someone beside him, her hand lightly brushed his sleeve. Not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to spark recognition. He didn't pull away. Instead, he laughed at something she said. That low, familiar laugh that once belonged only to me. I felt it deep in my chest, that mix of disbelief and quiet fury, the kind that doesn't burst but simmers, waiting. She had no reason to act so comfortable, not unless she knew her presence was allowed. That realization burned. He wasn't surprised to see her, he was anticipating her. He had invited her into this space, into a night that was supposed to celebrate family and loyalty, and now they moved around each other, with the ease of two people reacquainted with an old rhythm. Every tilt of their heads, every shared glance, was a reminder that I had been unknowingly cast into a play where they were the leads, and I was simply the observer. But I watched differently now. I wasn't just a wife betrayed, I was a woman studying every tell, every silent confession. I noticed how his eyes softened when she spoke, how his hand lingered on the back of her chair when he passed by, as though muscle memory betrayed him. I noticed how she angled herself toward him when she laughed, how she let her fingertips trace the rim of her glass, waiting for him to notice. They thought they were subtle, that the noise of celebration masked their familiarity, but I saw it all. There was a time when those gestures had belonged to me, when his hand would rest on my shoulder during conversations, when his laughter was shared across crowded rooms meant only for our eyes to meet. Now I watched that same language being spoken between them, repurposed, recycled. It wasn't rage that filled me. It was clarity. The kind that comes when illusions finally dissolve, when you realize that sometimes betrayal doesn't shout, it whispers through the smallest actions. I took a sip of champagne and smiled when people spoke to me, perfectly poised, perfectly calm. Let them think I was blissfully unaware. Because in that awareness, I found something sharper than hurt, control. I knew now exactly what he valued, what she wanted, and how to make them both regret underestimating me. Each gesture they shared was a lesson, a revelation wrapped in elegance. And I absorbed every one of them, silently, waiting for the moment when observation would become strategy. It's remarkable how much strength it takes to stay still when every instinct inside you screams to react. I stood in that grand hall surrounded by glittering chandeliers, the echo of music pulsing through the air, and forced my body to remain calm. Every breath I took was measured, every expression carefully arranged. I smiled, nodded, exchanged pleasantries with guests, and looked every bit the composed, gracious hostess. But inside, I was calculating. Every moment of restraint was an act of silent rebellion against the chaos trying to surface. He had brought her here, to my family's celebration, and I refused to let either of them see me flinch. She laughed too easily, too often, as though the entire evening had been orchestrated for her amusement. She played her role perfectly, the charming guest, the effortlessly elegant woman who floated through conversations, with just enough sweetness to appear harmless. But her eyes, those practiced, knowing eyes, never strayed far from him. She wanted me to see it, to understand that she could still make him look her way, and maybe she did. But what she didn't realize was that my silence wasn't submission. It was control. I could have confronted him then and there. I could have let my emotions spill, demanded explanations, turned the night into a spectacle. But I knew that losing composure would give them both what they wanted. Instead, I stood tall in my gown, every movement graceful, my chin slightly lifted as though the air itself belonged to me. If she was testing boundaries, I was redrawing them in silence. My strength wasn't in shouting. It was in not giving them the satisfaction of reaction. He too seemed to sense the undercurrent in the air. There were moments when his eyes darted toward me, as if to check whether I had noticed the tension he was trying so hard to hide. I met his gaze each time with a calm that unnerved him. That subtle panic behind his practiced smile betrayed him more than any confession could. He'd underestimated me. He thought his choices would humiliate me, that I would retreat behind quiet politeness while he played host. But I had learned long ago that the most powerful weapon a woman can wield is composure. As the night went on, I became the center of quiet attention, not because of scandal but because of presence. People noticed my serenity, the way I carried myself as if nothing could touch me. The whispers that began to ripple around the room weren't about her. They were about me. Guests leaned in to compliment my grace, my poise, unaware that it was armor, polished to perfection. Each word of praise was a small victory, proof that I had shifted the power dynamic without saying a single thing. There were fleeting moments when her confidence wavered. I saw it in the way she looked at me across the room, her smile just a little too tight, her laughter a little too forced. She was waiting for me to react, to crumble, to confirm that her presence still mattered. But my calmness disarmed her. I held my champagne flute delicately, exchanged stories with guests, and even complimented her gown when our paths finally crossed. Her surprise was palpable, hidden behind a polite laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. That single interaction changed everything. I could feel the shift, the balance tilting, control returning to me. She may have once shared history with him, but I was the one shaping the narrative now. By refusing to let emotion dictate the moment, I became untouchable. My restraint wasn't weakness, it was strategy disguised as elegance. The more I smiled, the more uneasy they both became. Later in the evening, when the music softened and the speeches began, I caught him watching me. His expression was unreadable. Guilt, confusion, maybe even admiration. He had expected confrontation, maybe even drama, but instead he was faced with composure that mirrored confidence. That was the priceless lesson beginning to take form. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it exists in stillness, in the decision not to respond to disrespect with chaos. I kept my movements graceful, my voice even, my demeanor unbreakable. Every word I spoke to guests, every step I took across that glittering floor, became a declaration that I would not be shaken by a single person's audacity. I was no longer reacting to his choices, I was reclaiming my narrative, quietly but decisively. The more I smiled, the smaller they looked beside me. Even the photographers seemed to sense it. Every flash captured me in control, radiant under the chandelier lights, untouched by the storm that brewed quietly beneath the laughter and music. I didn't need to expose their shared glances or whispered words. The silence around me spoke louder. It said I was not a woman to be humiliated, not someone whose composure could be fractured by an old flame. That night, while everyone else was blinded by the celebration, I was fully awake, aware of every detail. My calm became a mirror for their guilt, my poise a reminder that no one, no matter how bold, could rewrite my story without my permission. Whispers have a way of moving faster than music, slipping through laughter, gliding over champagne glasses, and finding their way into every quiet corner of a crowded room. At first it was just a glance exchanged between two guests, a subtle look that said, "Did you see that?" Then, like ripples spreading across still water, the murmurs began. People leaned closer to one another, their voices low but charged with curiosity. It wasn't long before the energy in the room changed, not visibly but unmistakably. You could feel it in the pauses between songs, in the slight hesitation of waiters serving wine, in the way conversations trailed off as eyes shifted toward the same corner of the hall. I didn't need to hear the words to know they were about us. The sight of her standing too close to my husband, the shared glances, the barely restrained tension, it had not gone unnoticed. High society loves nothing more than a beautiful scandal dressed in silk. The very people who had spent the night complimenting my dress and congratulating my family were now dissecting every silent exchange happening just a few feet away. The laughter that once filled the hall now carried a sharp edge, softened by forced politeness but flavored with intrigue. I watched it all unfold with quiet detachment, as though observing a play I had somehow been written into without consent. Every whisper felt like a brushstroke on a portrait I hadn't agreed to pose for. Still, I stood there, poised, unmoved. It's strange how gossip feeds itself. The less you react, the more people lean in, desperate for a crack in your expression. They wanted to see embarrassment, a hint of pain, anything that would confirm the rumors starting to take shape. But I gave them nothing. My calmness only deepened their curiosity. At the center of it all, she seemed to thrive under the growing attention. Her laughter grew a little louder, her gestures a little more animated, as though the whispers were applause meant for her performance. I could almost admire her boldness if it weren't so pathetic. There was a hunger in the way she interacted with him, as though reclaiming fragments of a past she believed she still owned. And him, he wore his discomfort like a tailored suit, trying to maintain control, trying to appear unaffected, yet every movement betrayed unease. He was realizing, perhaps too late, that what he thought he could keep quiet was now public property. From my place near the floral archway, I noticed small clusters forming, friends whispering behind manicured hands, couples exchanging knowing looks. It didn't take long before the gossip twisted itself into stories. One version had her as a surprise guest. Another claimed she had been invited out of guilt. Another painted it as an act of revenge. I didn't correct any of them. Truth at that point was irrelevant. What mattered was how perception would shape the rest of the evening, and I understood that better than anyone else in that room. The wedding planner approached me once, a nervous smile on her lips, asking if everything was all right. I told her it was perfect. My tone was calm, reassuring. I even raised my glass and toasted to the couple on the dance floor, who remained blissfully unaware of the silent storm brewing around them. That gesture alone sent a clear message. I was not the woman to pity. I was the one controlling the narrative, even if no one realized it yet. The whispers eventually grew softer, but never disappeared completely. They lingered, floating just beneath the surface of laughter and music, transforming the air into something electric. I could feel eyes following me as I moved through the crowd, assessing my every reaction. They expected bitterness, confrontation, drama. But instead, they saw a woman untouched by scandal. My poise became a kind of mystery, the calm at the center of their speculation. She noticed it too. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes when I crossed paths with her again. Perhaps she had expected me to retreat, to hide, to avoid confrontation. Instead, I greeted her with a measured smile, my words soft but deliberate. It was enough to make her falter. The whispers that had once fueled her confidence began to shift, now turning on her. I saw the curiosity in the guests' faces morph into judgment, not toward me, but toward her. The line between intrigue and disdain is a thin one, and she had just crossed it. By the time dessert was served, the energy in the room had changed entirely. What had begun as subtle gossip had turned into quiet condemnation cloaked in civility. People no longer spoke her name with amusement, but with disapproval. My husband, realizing the weight of the stares, tried to mask his discomfort by focusing on meaningless conversation, but I saw it in his clenched jaw and his restless hands. He knew what he had done. He had invited a spark into a room full of oxygen, and now everyone could see the smoke. As the evening unfolded, the whispers no longer hurt me, they fueled me. Each one reminded me that the story was shifting, that I was no longer the subject of pity but of admiration. They could talk as much as they wanted, because when all the murmurs faded, I would still be the one standing tall, untarnished, and she would be the one remembered as the woman who crossed the line at someone else's family celebration. The decision formed slowly, not in anger but in precision. I stood there amid the glitter and chatter, watching the game unfold, realizing that silence had carried me as far as it could. It was time to move from observation to strategy. If humiliation was the gift he had chosen to give me that evening, I would return it wrapped in gold, with grace, intelligence, and an elegance he could never match. My power wouldn't come from confrontation, but from turning his careless cruelty into a spectacle of control. I would not raise my voice. I would raise the standard. As the orchestra transitioned into a softer melody, I excused myself from a group of guests and walked toward the event coordinator. My tone was calm, my smile genuine, but every word I spoke carried intention. I requested a small change in the program, something subtle but powerful. The toast to the couple originally planned for the best man would now include a few words from me. It wasn't unusual after all. I was the bride's sister-in-law and had played a major role in organizing the event. No one questioned it. They simply nodded, grateful that I was taking initiative. I spent the next few moments preparing, not with notes or speeches but with composure. My plan wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about reflection, making sure every person in that room, including him and his unwelcome guest, saw exactly who I was. I wouldn't need to mention her name, nor expose his actions. I would let my presence, my words, and my calmness draw the contrast so clearly that they'd both wish they had never tested me. When the toast began, the room quieted. Glasses were raised, lights dimmed just slightly, and all attention turned toward me. I stood at the microphone, my gown catching the glow of the chandeliers, every movement deliberate, every breath steady. My voice carried warmth as I spoke about love, not the kind that sparkles in photographs but the kind that withstands storms, that grows through honesty, respect, and loyalty. I spoke about how true partnership isn't proven in luxury, but in quiet integrity when no one is watching. The audience hung on every word, their faces soft with admiration, unaware that each line was layered with meaning. As I continued, I allowed my eyes to sweep across the room until they landed on him. His expression tightened. He knew. My words weren't random, they were precise. Each sentence was a mirror reflecting back the choices he had made, the disrespect he had allowed. I spoke of how betrayal often arrives dressed as familiarity, how sometimes the people who smile at us are the same ones who test the foundation we've built. My tone remained gentle, never bitter, but the message was undeniable. When I finished, the applause was genuine, the kind that comes not just from politeness but from admiration. Guests turned to him, smiling, nodding, congratulating him for having such a strong, gracious wife. Their words sliced through the air with poetic irony. I could see the discomfort in his posture, the forced smile as he tried to respond. Every compliment I received became a silent reprimand to him. He had wanted to make me small, but I had filled the entire room. She stood in the back, her confidence cracking just slightly. I caught her watching me, her expression unreadable, The realization was dawning on her that she had been outplayed not through confrontation but through poise. I didn't need to drag her name into the light. I simply had to remind her that she didn't belong in mine. The applause that followed wasn't just for the toast. It was a collective acknowledgement of something deeper. The whispers that once fed her ego were now turning against her. The same people who had gossiped earlier were now praising my grace, my strength, my class. After the toast, guests approached me, one after another, showering me with compliments. My husband tried to speak to me, but I kept my answers brief, controlled, detached. I wanted him to feel the distance he had created, the quiet coldness that comes not from rage but from indifference. He had expected tears, confrontation, maybe even a public scene. Instead, he received silence wrapped in elegance, a punishment far more enduring. Throughout the rest of the night, I carried myself like the event had always been mine to command. I laughed when appropriate, danced when asked, smiled at guests with effortless charm. Every move I made told the same story, that no one could shake my dignity. Even she began to fade into the background, her earlier confidence dimming as she realized the crowd, admiration had shifted entirely toward me. By the end of the night, the narrative had been rewritten. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate me had transformed into a lesson neither of them would forget. I didn't need to expose anyone. I didn't need to fight. The way I handled myself had spoken louder than any accusation could. My calm had become my weapon, my intelligence the stage, and my composure the final act of quiet victory. The night reached its peak when the lights softened, and the music slowed into a waltz that seemed to draw every emotion into focus. The guests had begun to relax again, unaware that beneath the polished surface of laughter and celebration, something far more deliberate was unfolding. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, watching him approach with that carefully practiced smile he used when trying to mask discomfort. The toast had changed everything. The room now belonged to me. Every whisper, every curious glance, every word of admiration now carried my name, not his, not hers. And yet, the final act of the evening had yet to begin. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. I let him take it, my expression calm, unreadable. The orchestra began another piece, and we moved together through the motions of a dance that looked effortless but was laced with tension. To everyone watching, we appeared the perfect couple, graceful, poised, united. But beneath the synchronized steps and polite smiles, an unspoken conversation was taking place. His grip was firmer than usual, his voice low when he finally spoke. He whispered something meant to sound apologetic, but the words felt hollow. I met his gaze with quiet detachment, my silence louder than any response. He was beginning to understand. The humiliation he had planned had backfired spectacularly. The woman he had invited as a silent challenge now stood in the corner, half forgotten, her smile faltering with every passing moment. Guests who had once been drawn to her confidence were now turning away politely, their interest dulled. She had come to this wedding expecting to make an impression, perhaps even to rekindle a spark that had long since burned out. Instead, she was now nothing more than a ghost at the edge of someone else's triumph. As the song ended, I withdrew my hand gracefully and turned toward a group of guests who were calling me over for another toast. He hesitated, watching me walk away, perhaps realizing for the first time that I no longer belonged in his shadow. The power dynamic between us had shifted, subtle yet absolute. For years I had been the calm in his storms, the one who absorbed the discomfort, who smoothed the chaos he created. But that night, I became something else. Unreachable, untouchable, and most of all, unforgettable. The priceless lesson wasn't taught through words but through demonstration. He learned what it meant to stand beside a woman who could turn humiliation into art, who could wield grace as a weapon sharper than vengeance. There was no need to shout, no need to reveal his betrayal to anyone. Everyone in that room already knew without it being said. The guests could sense the current that had shifted, the admiration for me, the quiet discomfort in his demeanor, the fading confidence of the woman he had once thought could unsettle me. Later, as the evening drew to a close, I found myself standing on the terrace overlooking the city lights. The cool air brushed against my skin, carrying with it the distant hum of laughter from inside. I could see their reflections in the glass door, him standing a few feet behind me, hesitant, and her by the exit pretending to be absorbed in conversation with someone who wasn't listening. The night had stripped away their pretense. She now looked like someone out of place, a decoration that didn't belong in the picture. And he looked smaller than I had ever seen him, not physically, but in presence. The arrogance that once defined him had wilted under the weight of realization. He stepped closer, perhaps to apologize again, to explain, to salvage what he could. But I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I turned slightly, offered a polite, distant smile, and thanked him for the evening, for the dance, for everything. My tone was calm, but my words carried finality. He searched my face for warmth, but there was none left for him. The lesson had been delivered, not in anger, not in confrontation, but in the quiet elegance of indifference. Inside, people continued to celebrate, blissfully unaware that a silent reckoning had taken place just beyond the lights. I rejoined the crowd, laughing softly at a guest's story, every inch of me composed, radiant, in control. The night was mine again, every detail bending toward my poise. She slipped out quietly not long after, her departure unnoticed by most. But I noticed. I watched as the door closed behind her, the echo of her heels fading into the distance, and felt no satisfaction, no bitterness, just completion. By the time the final song played, everyone was speaking about the same thing. Not the scandal, not the tension, but my composure, my words, my strength. The whispers that had once been cruel had transformed into admiration. He stood on the sidelines, forced to witness the respect I had earned, the grace I had displayed, the control he had foolishly underestimated. The night that was meant to diminish me had instead elevated me beyond reach. He had invited his past into my present, hoping perhaps to test my boundaries or remind me of what once was. Instead, he had given me the perfect stage to show him, and everyone else, what true power looks like when wrapped in elegance and restraint. And in that quiet, glittering room filled with fading music and lingering stares, he finally learned the difference between love built on possession and love built on respect. That night wasn't just about a wedding or a betrayal. It became a lesson in silent strength. In a world that thrives on spectacle, I learned the power of composure, the art of letting dignity speak louder than outrage. He wanted to test my limits, to see how much I could endure, but instead, he watched me rise beyond reach. The woman he had invited to unsettle me faded into the background, while I stood in the center of every conversation, calm and unshaken. I didn't need revenge, I needed only self-respect, and that was more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. The lesson was simple. True worth doesn't need validation, and real grace leaves its mark without chaos. That night, he lost his illusion of control, and I reclaimed my peace, proving that silence, when chosen with strength, can echo louder than any storm.